Hello there. On Sunday, I informed you that Brits have to accept the loss of their EU citizenship because of Brexit. And the ECJ ruled that this was a sovereignty-made decision by the United Kingdom. And there were a lot of comments under the video that showed me that some of the false information we know for years out there needs to be corrected. And I could see that this is still the case in the comments. And correcting, that is what I will do today. We start with a claim that is still coming up. That's not the Brexit I voted for. Well, on the screen you can see what Brexit the people voted for that went to go voting on the day of the referendum in 2016. And it was just one simple question with two very simple answers. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? And the two answers on the ballot paper just were remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union. So there was nothing on the ballot paper about the future relationship between the UK and the EU. It's especially always funny when people say, I voted for a WTO Brexit, or I voted for a hard Brexit. No, you didn't. You just voted if you wanted to remain or leave the EU, and nothing else. And that is all. And all that came later was decided by the government that a majority of the voters in the form of the electoral system in the UK, yeah, it's complicated, voted for. They made the decision. The UK Parliament made the decision. It's a representative democracy there, as it is here in Germany, just with a completely different electoral system. And there's another, I got tons of times. Only nations can issue passports. There is no such thing as an EU citizenship. Well, the claim that there is no EU citizenship has come up so often. But people really should educate themselves before talking, because I can show you that very easily, even from the homepage of the European Union, and in this case the European Commission. There is a part EU citizenship. Any person who holds the nationality of an EU country is automatically also an EU citizen. EU citizenship is additional to national citizenship and does not replace it. And this is a prerequisite for another comment later on about earning EU citizenship, but I will talk about this more later. But so you see, yes, there is EU citizenship. You have your national citizenship in a member state of the EU, and the EU citizenship, and both give you certain rights and privileges, and of course also obligations you have to follow. And then there was one, I think it's worth at least answering to that. It was, why complaining to the ECJ? They should have filed their lawsuit against the British government. It was its decision to leave after all. The point why they complained to the ECJ was they didn't only complain in general about losing their EU citizenship. They also complained and went with this court against the decision of the EU Commission to accept the withdrawal agreement. So that was a very nice try by those who went to court. They failed in the end, but they tried a little bit more of a creative approach by acting against the Commission's approval of the withdrawal agreement. So that only could have been done at the ECJ. And there were more comments like, yeah, they should sue at UK courts. UK courts have no say about EU citizenship. Yeah, and there's one I at least have to bring up. One, this is out of the club means you can't use the club's playground. There are a lot of different versions of this everywhere, but of course it means if you leave the European Union, then you are not entitled to all the privileges that come with membership. And that is something the Brexiteers in government had to learn the hard way. And Brexiteers outside the government still are not getting that. It means if you're out of the club, you can't use their facilities. And for the next one, I just picked one example of many that wrote that the vote was not democratic at all because there, as immigrants in other countries for a certain time, were not allowed to vote in the referendum. But as much as you know me criticizing the UK government for a lot of things and even criticizing the electoral system, the people in the UK obviously never had a problem with the rules. I guess it's after 15 years as an immigrant in another country, you are not allowed to vote in the UK anymore. But obviously the people weren't very concerned about this. They could have done something against it by voting for a party that would want to change this, or going to the streets and demanding a change. And if any party would follow their lead, then vote for that party. But before the Brexit referendum, obviously nobody cared, or very few people cared, obviously mostly those that already emigrated to another country. But it is the electoral law in the UK, and this law was set up democratically on the basis of the law of the United Kingdom. As much as I have criticism for no written constitution, for the electoral law with first past the post and in general elections, and so on, this is the law in the UK, and it doesn't break international law. So you have to say that the vote on the Brexit referendum was democratic. I'm sorry, guys. And then I have one, I picked one I usually wouldn't pick because of the language, but it shows the best what I mean on this position about who needs to be EU citizen. We have been British citizens for 1500 years. Well, first of all, in those 1500 years, you have been subjects of the Vikings, of the Saxons, of the Anglo-Saxons, and many others, the Normans. So you have been ruled by Danish, you have ruled by Germans, you have been ruled by French. So that's not always the same crown. And first, on the other hand, the United Kingdom is there since 1707, and all the time before that, there was a Scottish ruler, there was an English ruler, even if they were the same person in times. It's a lot different. And what they completely forget at that point is all British citizens were EU citizens until December 31st in 2020, when Brexit officially happened. And then I have to pick one thing quickly. The thing with the majority of the British voters did not vote to leave. It was the voters that went to there on the day, etc. I usually say in my videos always, the voters on that day decided. And it is what it is. Yes, it wasn't the majority of the British who are eligible to vote, but it was the majority of the voters that went to vote. And those who didn't go, although they could have gone, it's their own fault. And I cannot count them in. That is democracy. Even in a general election, if only 20% go to vote, it is a democratic election. Because deciding not to go to vote is a stupid decision. And I always tell that everyone. And in elections where I'm standing, and then people come afterwards at some time and say, why is this decision made like this? Why don't you have the majority to do this? Then I just ask, have you been to the vote? And when they say no, yeah, then don't complain. If you don't go vote, don't complain. You have no right to complain, in my point of view. And that is the same here. A lot of people didn't go to the vote, although just because they thought, it won't happen anyway, so I better go to the beach, I better go stay in front of my telly or whatever. And it happened because a lot of people didn't go. And so, yes, it's true, and I always try to say this in my video, the voters that went to vote on the day decided, and the majority of them decided on Brexit. but they are only the ones that count. Nobody that didn't go to vote counts here. And there on the comment is the other one with the "we are not allowed." That is the law, and it's the rightful law in the UK. If you want to change it, you have to take it to your parties and find one that wants to change it, and then vote for that one and get this party a majority. And then there's one that came often as well. That's the EU is better off without the UK. Well, in general, that's not true. Of course, Brexit is not a good thing for the EU either. It's not hitting the EU as much as it hits the UK itself, but it's still not a good thing for the EU. In a certain sense, this makes sense, so to speak, because, of course, the decision making in the EU is not made even more difficult than it is now with Hungary and Poland, with some sniper shots from British in the Commission, not in the Commission, in the Council or in Parliament. But overall, it's not good for the EU that the British are gone. But it's their sovereign decision to do so, and yeah, we couldn't do anything about it. At the time, the most people in the EU would have preferred that Brexit would not happen. But that was the decision of the voters on the day that went to vote on the referendum. And then there was one comment several times that probably everyone can answer for themselves, but I have to bring it up because the question why the EU has failed to protect the 49% of the UK citizens who voted against Brexit. The EU has to protect the citizens of its member states. And also the people in the UK that did not vote for Brexit are not EU citizens anymore. And so it's not the job of the EU to do anything for them. The EU has enough problems with Brexit to take care of their own companies, of their own people that are affected by Brexit, because they are. And that's why the EU set up a lot of funds for those companies and people affected. And that is their job. It is not their job to protect people of a third country. In case of Brexit now, there are different things like asylum laws, etc., of course. But in case of Brexit, it's not their job to protect people of a third country. As sorry as I am for everyone who wanted to remain, and who went, especially to those who went to the vote and voted Remain. But the decision is what it is. And then there were a lot of comments, now we can kick out all the EU citizens because of that ECJ decision and a lot of other nonsense. And of course, there is a regulation in the UK for EU citizens that have been there before Brexit. The same is in the EU with the people living there before Brexit legally and regularly. We come to that point a bit later. But of course they can't be thrown out. That's part of the withdrawal agreement. How to deal with EU citizens in the UK and how to deal with UK citizens that are regularly living in the EU before Brexit is all negotiated and signed in the withdrawal agreement. With the other things, with the pre-settled status, with the settled status, and so on, is, I have to use the word again, settled, and they just have to do their job. With the applications have to be done and so on. But that is all cared for. Here in Germany, we even did the citizenship thing. Every British that lived regularly in Germany before Brexit could apply for German citizenship. And they were even allowed dual nationality, so 2 passports. There was a deadline and that's over, but that was, for example, what Germany did. So they made it quite easy for British people that regularly lived here in Germany before Brexit. And the next one, Hi Son of Viking, just shows what I was telling you anyway, but Son of Viking is a regular viewer, and he made it very clear in his comment, and that's why I picked this one. Well, this ruling confirms us that all 27 EU member states are sovereign and that in matters of citizenship, the EU cannot force any state to grant citizenship status, permitting residents from a third country to automatically avail all of the benefits of their country's citizenship. And that's true. Despite everything that was said in the Leave campaign and that Brexiteers are still talking about now, about the EU dictatorship and all this other bullshit, the EU has no say in the citizenship of the individual member countries. That are 27 sovereign countries that within their sovereignty decided to make certain contracts and agreements with 26 other countries to form the EU, so to speak, and how the rules within the EU are. That were all sovereign decisions of sovereign countries. So all the sovereignty nonsense from the Leave campaign, especially when you think about that the UK was there since the 70s, and a lot of the rules made in the EU are made with the consent of the British government, is kind of hilarious. And then there was this comment about the brother of Mick Jagger, or the wife of the brother of Mick Jagger. I haven't read that one myself in The Guardian, but that story showed me one thing, that people, even people that are related to celebrities, still haven't informed them enough about the current situation after Brexit. Because I can give you one example, a friend of mine who is German, but her husband and her sons, of course, are British and living in the UK. She's visiting us regularly here, and she has no problem with getting back home because she has her settled status, she can prove it, and she is coming in another 3 weeks or something to Germany again. So there is no problem. But you, of course, need to have all your papers together so you can prove that you live there. And then you have no fuss at the border when you try to re-enter the country. And so it is really important to inform yourself, like it was important before Brexit for many British immigrants in the EU. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll come to that one later. And then there's quite a harsh one, but brings up a point that I need to talk about. I don't want to go too much into detail of this comment I'm showing you right now. But of course, there will indeed some of the voters, of the Leave voters, because many of them were from the older generation, will not be here anymore. And a lot of younger people who were not allowed to vote in 2016 but could vote now would very probably remain if the vote was today. But it doesn't help us. It's the same with the whataboutism I always say I don't allow on this channel. When we're talking about one topic, whataboutism has no place here. And the same goes for this referendum. We can talk about a lot of different cases, what could have been, if, when, what, but it wasn't. It was that the majority that went to vote on that day voted Leave. And that is the only point that matters, not how people would vote now. There is no referendum, and there's no big party that even has a chance to win the next general election saying that there will be another referendum. Labour does not want another referendum. Starmer clearly says he wants to make Brexit work. Although this is complete bullshit as much as get Brexit done from Boris Johnson in 2019. It won't work. It will never work. Brexit will always be worse than EU membership. But you have no chance for another referendum at the moment. And so it's absolutely wasted time to talk about it. And wasted breath to talk about what would have been when and who might have what. The people have voted as they voted on that day, or stayed at home as they did on that day. And then the typical one, the EU wants to make it hard for the UK because of Brexit, because of this, because of that. They always try to play the victim card here. And Brexiteers do that from the beginning. No, the EU does not try to make it hard from the UK. The EU does what the EU has to do towards a third country. The second the UK left the EU, they were a third country with all the rights and privileges of a third country under WTO, unless there came an agreement. And we have this agreement. It's the TCA, the Comprehensive Trade Agreement, that doesn't include services too much. That is what the EU had to do, and they're not making it anything hard. The ones that made it really hard for the UK were the government of the UK and the Tory party, because they made it much harder for the UK to have Brexit and how to have Brexit than it was necessary. But the Brexiteers will never stop blaming the EU for everything. But the nice thing is there are a lot of things today they can't blame the EU for anymore, because it's domestic politics now. It was before Brexit, but now they see that it is domestic politics. And a lot of things they blamed the EU for in the Leave campaign was homemade, because there were a lot of things they could have done, although they were an EU member. They just didn't do because their government didn't want it at the time. And there were a lot of things they didn't have to do because they were an EU member, because they could decide themselves, because all the 28 EU members at the time were still sovereign nations, only bound by certain agreements they decided to sign as sovereign nations. And then there's one other thing you see in this comment, besides the fact about being allowed to vote or not, I talked about earlier in the video. Here's the point that people claim that EU citizenship can be earned somehow by living there for a certain time and by paying taxes or whatever. No, you cannot earn EU citizenship as a citizen of a third country. The only way to gain EU citizenship is what I showed you in the beginning of the video. By becoming a citizen of an EU member state. That is how you become an EU citizen. And there is no other way, and there shouldn't be any other way. I'm sorry, but the EU is for the people of the EU member states and for nobody else. Oh yeah, and then the fun one, who wants EU citizenship anyway? First of all, probably asked by someone who had EU citizenship until 2020. And just to answer the question that came up several times, I can tell you that the majorities of countries all over Europe want EU citizenship, because sooner or later all the countries in Europe, with very few exceptions, will be members of the EU. And most people living in Europe will be EU citizens sooner or later, because that is the will of the majority of the people in so many countries that are queuing up to be members of the EU. Yeah, and then I had to pick one comment I cannot counter that much, but it was quite right, because in the Leave campaign, Farage, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and many others made it sound as if they can have their cake and eat it, so that the UK can leave the EU, still can have all the benefits of the EU, but none of the obligations anymore. And that people fell for that nonsense is the real tragedy here. All those lies in the Leave campaign, all those promises of, in Germany would say there is roasted chicken hanging from the trees, or no, that was golden apples on the trees and roasted chicken flying in the sky just for you to grab. All those promised unicorns that people could fall for it, that is the real tragedy in this whole thing. And even more tragic is that, as I could see in the comments under especially this video, how many people are still out there that still believe in all those promises. Not to mention a comment in the Daily Telegraph I read today. I will talk about this in another video in the next days because it was hilarious. But Boris Johnson is gone, but Brexit is still alive, and all the benefits that's still to come. They now try to blame everything on the government, although their core Brexiteers were at the helm to get Brexit done. And now they're still blaming the government for not getting Brexit properly done. They just don't want to admit that it will never be done the way they want it, because the way they want it, with the benefits and everything else, that is the big unicorn still. That will never happen, because it cannot happen. You cannot have a real unicorn. Yeah, and then of course I must not forget to mention Scotland in this one. Tom, I know you comment a lot on the situation because of Scotland and Brexit, but it's getting more complicated, I must say. Of course, the majority of the people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU, as did the majority of the people in Northern Ireland. And they were completely ignored by the British government. Because if you would have thought that through properly, and if Cameron would have thought that through properly, but he never expected to lose, he, in the first place, would have said only if a majority in all 4 nations of the UK vote in favor of leaving, then we'll leave. No, he made it one general election or one general referendum, and so it went over the heads of the Northern Irish and the Scottish. But Scotland to return will need another referendum, and I always champion the right of the Scottish people to have another referendum because of the changed situation with Brexit. Because when they voted in 2014, of course, they did it to stay in the EU, because only as a member of the United Kingdom they could stay in the EU immediately. But then Brexit came, and so the whole situation completely changed. But they tried all legal ways, and without the consent of the UK government, they cannot have another referendum. I don't see any legal way anymore after they accepted the judgment of the Supreme Court that ruled the same, that they can have another referendum in the near future. And the grassroots movement that Hamza Yousaf, for example, always promoted, I don't hear too much about this at the moment, and that it's working. So, and with the condition of the S&P at the moment, it doesn't make it easier either. So I'm not very confident at the moment to see another Scottish referendum in the near future. And that is a pity, but unfortunately the way I see it at the moment, as much as I would love to see it differently. And then I have a comment that's not very nice with good, the British are third country citizens, nothing more. Yes, the British are third country citizens from the point of view of the European Union. But the nothing more is not true. There are a lot of third countries the EU has no agreements with. The EU does have certain agreements in the TCA with the United Kingdom and in the withdrawal agreement about UK citizens living in the EU before Brexit and the EU citizens living in the UK before Brexit. And so it's not just they are third countries citizens, nothing more. They have a little bit more, but not as much as many would want. That's the point. But they are, just like other third countries, now a third country from the point of view of the EU. And then there's something I read several times as well, I commented on it already. Time for a new referendum then. As I said earlier, I don't see a new referendum coming in the near future. Perhaps in a few decades. I don't know what happens in the UK until then. But at the moment, who would start this referendum? Which government? Who do you want to vote into government with some kind of a chance to have a second referendum? I don't see that. And then I was thankful to have an example from another country. I said something about Germany, and we talked about Spain in the past already. that a lot of the problems UK citizens, so UK immigrants in certain EU countries have nowadays, are because they did not do what they're supposed to do before Brexit living in those countries. And then I got this example from Sweden, because people are expelled from the EU because they were not registered before Brexit and cannot prove that they legally stayed in these countries before Brexit. Because just being an EU citizen doesn't mean you can, it means you can move and work freely all over the EU, but you still have to stick to the rules of that sovereign EU member state. And they have rules, if you want to work and live there, also about registration. And many of the British, of course, I don't say they're all very, like others in the comments said, that they are just arrogant and they don't need to because they're British. Well, I give them that many British probably even wouldn't expect that and were a bit naive there. Let's put it that way, because in the UK you don't have to do it. You don't have to register your flat with a home office, for example. It's not a home office here; it's the municipality. But everyone here in Germany is registered where you live, and you have to register within 14 days after moving. And after moving into a flat, you have 14 days max to register that you're living in that flat. And that's not what they're used to in the UK. And so I give them that. But that was the big problem for many UK citizens living in EU member states, that they have never registered that they live there, that they never have followed the law of the country where they emigrated to. And then they couldn't prove that they legally lived there because they didn't. When they haven't followed the law with registering and everything, they have never legally lived there under EU law even, although the rules were made by the individual countries. And that's another point with the registration and everything. Those are the rules of the sovereign individual EU member states, what you have to do if you want to live there. And they just didn't. And that's why they were expelled from Spain, they were expelled from France, they were expelled from Sweden in this case. And that has nothing to do with that the EU is not doing anything for the UK citizens as the UK is doing for EU citizens. No, the EU is doing a lot for UK citizens that legally and following all the laws before Brexit living in the EU. There the EU is doing a lot for those people. I had a lot of comments where people commented, well, I live in the EU since before Brexit and I had no problem. It was just quick paperwork and all done. And I'm still there. But too many didn't do that. And those people that in fact broke the law are the ones that are in trouble now. It's not the EU doing that. It's because those people broke the law in this EU member state. But I'm telling this to the reasonable viewers. I know the whole video is in vain for Brexiteers because they don't want to understand reason. They just have their headlines and their popular stuff, and that's it. But a lot of people who don't deal with Brexit that much, I do it for years now, so I know a lot about the details. And those people might be interested in getting a few more little detail facts that put something into perspective. And then one more thing I won't put on the screen because that's from among many from one of our standard trolls again. But Ellie, I leave that one in just for you to toy around with. The referendum was binding, and so the government had no chance but to fulfill what was in the referendum. And I thought that wouldn't come up anymore because even Nigel Farage in public said that this referendum was not binding. Because even Nigel Farage knew if that referendum was binding, it would have been illegal to do it that way. No, it wasn't binding. It was just kind of a expensive poll to ask the whole country. The point why they executed what was decided in the referendum was that certain people promised to do that. Certain people that knew it was a mistake. There were a lot of Remainers in a government that had to execute Brexit. And they knew it was a mistake. But they promised before the referendum that they would do that. But it was never binding. And that is a point that I don't leave uncommented, because that crap is still spread in the comments again. And so just remember, even Nigel Farage admitted it was not binding. And so really, there can be no discussion from any Brexiteer anymore that this was binding. No, it wasn't. And just one question on the video that was not Brexit related, but an important one. Unfortunately, on a video that so many people saw. I'm very sorry for this, but at the moment it's hot like hell in Germany, and it still is. And this is as a reason why this is the first video I'm filming today, because on my last one today I'm gonna be breaking out in sweat like hell. It's really warm in Germany. I heard that a friend of Finland is traveling through Bavaria at the moment and loves the weather. Yeah, on holidays I would love the weather as well. But with more than 30 degrees out there, all the big lights in here and the heating up of the house, because of the many days it's hot already, although it was just the beginning of June when that started, and it's not even summer. Some of my equipment just gave up. So this, I apologize for the sound in the last video, but I couldn't do anything about this in the end. I needed a little bit to get everything started here again and working here again. And I know that you hear some annoying noise in the background the whole time at the moment. And I'm very sorry about this, but it's even hotter today, and to film this at all, especially with a video that's a bit longer again, I had to let it run. I know it's not a nice thing, and on the shorter videos it won't be, but I knew this was going to be a bit longer, and so I had to let it run so that the equipment will survive that. In Germany we are not that used to have ACs everywhere, and I can't just install an AC here because I rent this place, and I can't break through the walls and everything with an AC. And so it's not working very nicely, and the portable ones are that expensive. That's out of my price range. But nevertheless, Brexit is a thing that will keep us busy for a long time. And a lot of those things I talked about in this video, I had to make these clarifications on that video after reading a lot of those comments. Yes, I do. And that's why I just want to say there is a Brexit game as well on Outside Views Games. Maybe you should try playing it, and there are a lot of detailed questions you might still remember or might not remember, but give it a try. If you're interested in Brexit, that could be some fun for you. And on the other hand, soon I will put a post on my community post on this channel that you can send in questions under the post for the restart of my live streams. That will be in July. I hope it will not be that hot then, but we will see. If I'm melting in front of a live camera, so be it. But you will have the chance for the first edition to ask questions about Brexit, about UK politics. Whatever is a topic of this channel, you can ask freely. So as soon as you see the post, just write in the comments if you want to ask some questions. My patrons and my channel members here on YouTube had the chance for 2 weeks already to hand in questions, so they got a head start. And I will, of course, pick their questions. And from all the other questions, I just have a look through how many that are, how many I can do on just one live stream. So keep a lookout when the post will come. And if you want to see another video right now, instead of playing the Brexit game on Outside Views Games, there's another one right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.